So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about Yoda Press and Yoda Press books today, Sabine and Ananke. And uh, I hope Ashwati's video works this time. Um, and I'm really thrilled. Yeah, there you go. Really thrilled to have four incredible Yoda Press authors here with me on this panel today. And I'm going to introduce you all in terms of the books we published of yours. Otherwise, it's going to, be half the panel time gone. I hope that's all right with everyone. Yeah. So I'm going to go in the order of how I'm seeing you on the screen. So Chaura first, my dear friend Chaura, um, who's joining us. Are you in Paris right now? Which part of the world are you in? Yeah, you're in Paris right now. Chaura is a French-Iranian researcher, and the first time that we worked together was when we bought the rights to her first book, Le Cahier d'Aziz, which we published as Aziz's Notebook. The French edition was published by Gallimard, and it was a very personal story. We'll talk about it later if we have the time. And we bought the rights to bring out the English edition, which I believe is still the only English edition in the world. And Chaura came to the country to do a book tour, and we became really close friends, and the rest is history. But I will be asking her the first question I'll be asking her when we start the conversation, however, is about her new book, which too we are publishing in India, yay, in South Asia, which will also be the first English translation of her new book. But more on that later. Um, I'm going to go next to Pia Srinivasan. Pia published a fabulous edited volume with us last year called Living with the Weather, Climate Change, Ecology and Displacement in South Asia, which I think, climate crisis books on climate crisis is something that we have come to a little late at Yoda Press, because I always do about a year of homework, which is my homework, before I start sort of reaching out to authors or commissioning. And I think now there are about 3 or 4 of them coming out, but I think Pia, yours is the first one we've published at Yoda Press, which is on climate crisis. And we'll talk about that book, of course, in a little while. I'll move next to Bhashwati. Bhashwati, are you in Delhi right now, Bhashwati, or are you joining us from across the planet? No,
I am in
you're in
Delhi.
Delhi.
Yeah.
Okay, which is why it's not a beastly hour for you. Yeah. So Bhashwati is the only author here who will be talking about her novel. It's one of very few books of fiction that Yoda Press has published. Fiction is something we pick up very rarely, because we know that there are others who are much better at it than us. But I think it's also about what speaks to us in terms of the narrative, and uh, what blows us away, perhaps. And I think uh, Bhashwati's book, Victory Colony 1950, which has been deeply loved over the last few years that it's been out. And it's got the kind of love that while I was editing it, I felt for it on a daily basis. And it's so incredibly heartening to see the way readers have responded to it over the years. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit. And last but certainly not least, my dear friend Shilpa Phadke, the very eminent media studies person and sociologist, and she always gets irritated with me because I overdo all the introduction, and I'm doing exactly that to her just to embarrass her. So we're good friends. Who has been a friend of mine for some time, but we got really close over the making of a very special book that came out last year. It was called Yari. It was the first anthology on friendship by women and queer folks. And the book was in the making through the pandemic. So it was a very strange kind of friendship that burgeoned out of the pandemic around a book on friendship. And I'm so pleased to have you all here today. Yoda turns 20 this year, and Sabine said, we need to have this panel to celebrate Yoda. And I was like, I really don't know what celebration of Yoda would mean, apart from talking about its books and its authors and talking to its authors. And and I think um, that's what it means to me, talking to four authors who have really exemplified, whose books continue to exemplify what we want to do with the list at Yoda Press, and also for authors whose politics and whose persona and whose being is something I really resonate with. And the team at Yoda Press, little tiny team at Yoda Press, has loved working with these four people. That was another reason. So I'm going to first start with Chaura, because I know Chaura is also a little bit on the clock. And also because her book, the one that we're going to be talking about, that's the one book which is a forthcoming book. And in a lot of ways, and I know all of you will understand, it's sort of for me, it's going to be it's going to be an iconic publication. The book, which is coming out in French first, is called Femme, Vie, Liberté, which, of course, as you can already figure out, is a translation of the slogan that we have all become familiar with over the last year or so, which is Jan Zindagi Azadi. And which, of course, immediately reminds you of the very important movement that is underway, that has been underway in Iran for some time, after the tragic death of Mahsa Amini. So, Chaura, I'm going to go to you first, to talk to us a little bit about the making of this book and what making this book, which is in a sense really quite current, unlike your earlier book. And of course, there's some very, obvious logical reasons to that. But in a sense, you will obviously relate with them differently for that reason. This is so current. This is so tied to you professionally, politically, apart from being personal as well, I'm sure. How is it playing out? How has it played out, the making of this book and putting it out there? I think you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Arpita. Let me just start with showing a picture that is one of the legacies of this Women Life Freedom uprising that a friend of mine drew. So actually, yes, I'm very happy, and I contacted you. I reached out to you as soon as the project of translating the book came out, because I was in such a hurry to write it. I mean, it was written between April and June 2023. So as the movement was still kind of hot when I started writing on it. And it was published in French, but unfortunately, until now, the only book that exists in English on the Women Life Freedom movement is written by quite a conservative man, Omrash Azizi, and it really. And although also Marjan Satrapi wrote, she edited a collection of comics around the Women Life Freedom Uprising, but it's also men who have been male historian, male journalists who have been approached to write around this issue. So it's quite actually troubling how even these paradigm of feminist revolutionary power or potential is being commented on by men. So I think it's really, really important that this book comes out in English. Beyond even the writer's ego, I think it's important that it's been translated fast. And the way I wrote it fast, and it was written very differently from like Aziz's notebook. It's a testimony that I took 6 years to translate. It's a testimony that was kept in secret for 20 years before eventually I knew about it, and it talks about the past. So it's like quite on the contrary. Here we are in the heated situation. And things started when Gina Mahsa Amini was killed by the morality police in September 22. And I remember I was in Baltimore, so the city where uprisings, with the Black Lives Matter movement also was so important. And I remember I tweeted saying, many Iranian women were saying, Gina could have been me, and this is why I'm cutting my hair. This is why I'm going in the street. And I was, and I wrote, I don't think Gina could have been me, because don't forget she has been killed because she was a woman, but also because she was a Kurdish woman, and she was Kurdish. And as someone, I'm an anthropologist, and I worked on the border police in France and border control, and I saw how police kind of screened people according also to their social class and ethnicity, and that's how they arrest people at the border. And I think that the morality police also screened her and not any other middle class, poorly veiled Iranian woman, screened her as a Kurdish woman because she was Kurdish. And so there was some impunity, there was some freedom in the way they were violent with her, and as I wrote this as an example of intersectional oppression that enabled the women life freedom movement to root into intersectional demands of equality, of minority rights, and gender equality. So the three were extremely linked. Then these tweets went viral, and all of a sudden I realized that I had things to say. I had things to decode. And every day I was having this journal for myself of, I saw events on the social media and I linked them to past events in the Iranian society and the story of resistance. And this is why when I had the idea of making a book, I went back to that journal and most often then I tweeted some of those parts, bits and parts. But I decided, and this goes back to the previous panel, I decided to write the book in the form of chronicles. And this is an example for me. I was like, oh yeah, this is exactly like soft world building. Usually social science books, they're like, they explain to you the institution, the context, the demography, etc. And this was not the case. It's like a day by day chronicle of the event. It starts one day before the death of Gina, and it ends up on the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution, the 11th of February 2023. And every day, every micro event, so it's an archive, it's a secondary archive of the event, of the uprisings themselves, because it registers micro events that maybe will not be written down in history. But then by doing this each time, it's like a few pages development, sometimes a longer development, going back to the history of resistance in Iran and my own history, family history, and also Aziz's notebook and also the documentary I was making. So this is like the unfolding of 40 years of resistance and putting the women's struggle and making sense of that revolutionary uprising and why it is revolutionary within this longer history.
Right. So you said, do you also then refer back in these sort of micro moments to Aziz's notebook?
Absolutely, I do, and also to my to the documentary Hitch that I made, in which the notebook itself that plays an important role. So this notebook, this testimony that was written by my grandfather about state violence in the 1980s and how his two daughters, my mother and my aunt, were arrested and executed, and how their story is a history of resistance as well. This is a part, I refer to it because what has been found again, and this is my main argument, and actually it's funny because the Women, Life, Freedom book is a chronicle, so it doesn't have, a main argument, or it doesn't have, but yet it has an hypothesis. And I think it was an important hypothesis in the context of French society as well, where, the debates on veil and this kind of universal white feminism is so heavy, is to say, when women in Iran take out their veil and they burn it, what do they say? They are making a link again with a history of antagonism, of frontal opposition, of going to the front and saying we are opposed to that system, to that political regime. And this tradition, legacy of opposition, of radical opposition, is what has been lost in the Iranian society in the last 30 years. And it has been lost because of a history of mass violence and collective violence that was put under the carpet, that was erased. And as it is not tells this story of mass violence and collective violence. So it was important. It was like kind of the missing link to understand why this history of opposition, why this tradition of political opposition has been erased, and why it is so important to, like, this is the end of the reformist era, and we are going back into saying we don't want Islamic Republic. And this is why so I was reading the burning of the veil as a grammar of revolt, as a grammar of contestation that is being found again by the Iranian population. And it's not the men that are in solidarity with the women, but it's the men, when they applaud the women, when they honk for them and they call them women of honor, what they're doing is that they're sharing their gesture. They're taking it's as if they don't have the means to be that oppositional, because they don't have this symbolic veil to burn. So basically, Aziz's notebook is present in this book because I needed to go back layers upon layers in this history of violence and resistance. And what is interesting also in France is that Aziz's notebook has been republished in pocket format, and I wrote a new preface, and in this new forewords, I was saying, this book was published first after the 2009 Green Movement as a history of repression, and now it is being republished as both a history of repression and resistance. So this is a bit the missing link that is very important here. Yeah.
Right. What's really interesting to me is it's almost like a chronicle within a chronicle, which is, how Aziz's notebook being part of this is so exciting. The other thing I was thinking about is, of course, as you were speaking, I was remembering what was happening in our country at the same time, which is where we were all, Muslim women here were very rightly so and extremely powerfully pushing back against the attack on them wearing the hijab. And we were all standing by them and saying, it is, of course, their choice. And I remember the student of mine who did a hijabi student of mine who did a research paper on comparing the two situations, what was happening in Iran and what's happening here. And ultimately, it's about, of course, the control over the body and the control over attire that someone else, the man, the patriarchy, wants to have. Anyway, I'm going to come back to you, Chara, but we were talking about world building, and you mentioned, that you were interested by that phrase, soft world building, from the last panel. So I'm going to move to Bhashwati now, because, of course, Bhashwati with Victory Colony 1950 hit the ball out of the park, as they say, in terms of world building. And in a lot of ways, I don't know, I feel like it's the next one for me to go to after your discussion, because it's historic. It is, that story is so located in history and in memoir as well, as I'm sure Bhashwati will talk about more. And that's one of the things I've often thought about, Ashwati. Have you ever had the thought that, um, I mean, to develop that, I mean, the novel is, of course, breathtaking, and it also allowed you to do a lot of things which perhaps would not have been possible with thinking of it in terms of a memoir of someone else. But have you ever thought of it that way? Have you ever did you did you function with some rules of a memoir in mind when you were writing it the first time itself?
That's such a beautiful question, Arpita. And I think memory is sort of inseparable, when it comes to partition narratives. Memory is, I think, the glue that binds all these stories, and it is sort of the spine for these kinds of stories. So I did not consciously think of using that as a tool, but I think it invariably seeps into the story, because also I think it has germinated. The roots of this story are in my growing up as a third generation, quote unquote, refugee child, I would say, because it's my grandparents who witnessed this firsthand.
Right.
And they lived through that loss, and their entire life thereafter was built on a structure of memories of the place that they left behind, of the universe, that was lost to them forever. So I think I grew up on a diet of listening to a lot of memoir in an unstructured way, of course. But
How
so
lovely.
yes, so I think that is how that found its way into the story, although it's not my story, but I try to imagine it from the point of view of someone who is so young and who has a full life of ahead of herself, and yet has to fall back on memories to sustain herself in a new, very inhospitable, very difficult world. So I think it, although it's not structured as a memoir, it's very much structured like a fiction narrative. But I think parts of it probably will resemble a memoir in the way in which the protagonist thinks of her mother's food, for instance, the way she tries to recreate some of that, the camaraderie that the refugees share, which also harks back to the idea of a village, where she comes from. So I think, it's probably seeped in ways that I hadn't consciously thought of.
I've often wondered, I mean, I know it sounds like why, I mean, I completely will not blame you if you think to yourself right now, why is she asking me this question after all these years of having edited it and published it? But truly, I have thought this over and over again because, I've read that book again after we published it, because such a lovely story in terms of two individuals. So at the heart for the others, I mean, at the heart of Bharshati's story, there's the romance, and which is the most compelling thing about this book, because it's about the refugee experience after partition in East India. But at the heart of it is this romance between a refugee individual and someone who is local to Kolkata and who is sort of working with the refugees and refugee relief. And Bharshati, I was just wondering, did it ever worry you that your notion of your notion of romance in the 2000s will infect the romance narrative that is supposed to be set back in the 50s? Did that ever worry you?
No, I think it's probably on the contrary. I am such an old-fashioned, not in any bad way, I would say, but I sort of of an anachronistic perspective. So it's very easy for me to place myself in the past there are, I would say I'm pretty outdated when it comes to, what is current in terms of romance, or I probably won't do very well if I tried to write that. But this wasn't difficult for me at all because I grew up reading a lot of Bengali books. So
Right.
I was familiar with the Bengal of that time because I had read a lot of literature. So again, I did not do any conscious research extensively, I would say. I had to do some of it, of course, given that it's a historical novel and it's set in actual history. But I didn't have to do for a lot of mannerisms, for instance, or the lifestyle that people had, or the perspectives that they would have had at that time. And also, I think that, some aspects of love and emotions like that are timeless. They don't
Yeah.
really, they might have some maybe physical characteristics that evolve and change over time. But I think the emotion itself and how people
Mm.
feel and think and react, that probably hasn't changed since the time, civilization began, or even before that. I think we react the same way when we are hurt, when we react the same as we did 100 years ago to something that brings us happiness. So I think the love story itself was built on those very core principles of human emotions. So no, I was not at all hesitant to dive into it, or didn't feel uncomfortable at all.
Wonderful. I was just thinking, you're talking about human emotions, and that makes me move over to Shilpa, because Shilpa, of course, uh, you know, came to us with this incredible idea, Shilpa and our co-author Nithila, to put together this anthology on friendship by women in queer folks in India, in South Asia. As it turned out, three of the panelists on the previous panel are contributors to that volume, as Shilpa pointed out to me in the chat box. And uh, and that's something you found as well, isn't it, Shilpa? What Bharshati is just saying, that there's a sense of universality. I mean, even though we are in this completely new era, and then everybody was talking about the new normal, and then because there was a pandemic, and so many of these people were younger people who have had friendships play out completely in the digital space in that time at times, and yet there's a universality to the idea of Yari, which we all understood, which we all resonated with in the making of the book. Didn't you feel that,
Yeah, very much so.
Shilpa?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, yeah, very, very much so. Both in terms of sort of geographical reach and how people, anyone we talk to about the sort of, as we were editing it, anyone we talked to about the book, but also, as Bhaswati pointed out, also historically. If one went back and looked at cinema, or one looked at books, or one looked at, there is a sense of the sort of the depth of friendship and the ways in which people think about friendship or feel about their friends. And the book really very much came out of our thoughts on friendship during the pandemic.
Shilpa, you're on mute again.
Sorry,
Yeah.
accidentally. And the fact that we were reaching out and we were in touch with friends perhaps that we hadn't been so much in touch with before. We were doing online teas and so on and so forth. Pretty much like the kind of conversation we're having now. But it also came out of this kind of sense that historically both familial, that is the family you're born into, your familial relationships are centered and your romantic relationships are centered, that those are seen to be, but increasingly we saw people reaching out to their friends, and it was friends who were, and so we thought, what would change in the world really if we centered a conversation around friendship? And that's really where and like you say, that it really immediately had a kind of sort of almost universal sense of, yes, this is what we need, and this is what we should be talking about. And I mean, as so many of the essays in the book, sort of, they're also about how fraught friendship can be, right? As much as our natal relationships, as much as our romantic relationships, and so there's conversation about friendship breakups and so on and so forth. But in many ways, if
Hmm.
we were to talk about friendship, it doesn't come with the baggage of our natal families, and it doesn't come with the layered sort of historical baggage again of marriage and romance and patriarchy, because a lot of romance is heteronormative, and it
Yeah.
doesn't come with all of that baggage. And so it allows us to reimagine the world in a variety of ways.
Did you, when you were making the book, did you ever feel like, did people ever ask you the question that why are you doing something which seems like a very experimental, anthologizing, sort of documenting sort of thing, and not quite academically, not the sort of anthropological academic sort of work that you would take on for any other research, perhaps. Although I must say that I see shades of Violator in Yari. But how did you ever feel it?
We
Did you
never
ever
felt
get
it.
asked this
No,
question?
no, it's so interesting that you asked this, that nobody asked us. And you know how serendipitous are. And for instance, for me, because we're talking about the press, and because we're talking about 20 years of Yoda, when I read Because I Have a Voice in the early 2000s,
Hmm.
I think I don't know
Yeah.
what point you published Because I Have a Voice, that
Yeah,
was
that was in our second year.
by
My gosh.
right. So it was
Yeah.
quite an early book you published. That was edited by Gautam
Yeah.
Bhan and
Bhan,
and
Arvind
Arvind
Narayan.
Narayan, yeah. And I remember seeing it and thinking, my God, this is what publishing should look like, that it was academic, but it was also accessible. And in a sense, I feel like friendship, that Yari might remind you of a Biloiter, but it's also
Yeah.
modern in a certain way on my vision of what Because I Have a Voice looks like, because it
Oh, that makes me
engages
so
with
happy, Shilpa. Thank you.
issues, but it's also accessible, and it has a variety of authors, some of whom are new, some of whom are older, some of whom are established, and some of whom are publishing for the very first time. And in a sense, every time we told someone we're writing a book about friendship, people were thrilled. And for instance, I wrote to you on Twitter saying, "Look, I have an
Yeah.
idea. Can I pitch it to you?"
Yeah.
You were so
Yeah.
thrilled. I mean, it was so exciting.
Yeah. I could
Anyone,
not
yeah, anyone
believe
we
it.
told,
I was like,
we said,
yes, yes, please. Yeah.
yeah, anyone we said we're doing a book
Yeah.
on friendship, their response was exactly that. Yes.
Yeah. Really. And I mean, Yari, isn't Yari it's the same word in Farsi, Chaura? Yari? Friendship is Yari, even in Farsi is, right?
There are many. Yar is a friend, but it's more dosti. But Yar is a friend.
Ah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is why, I
We
mean, I
played
remember
we
we had so
played
many
with a lot
conversations
of
about
words.
what to
Yeah.
call the book. Yeah. Yeah.
And
And we
though and
were
that
wondering,
dosti was one of the words we considered
Dosti was one
actually.
of them. Yeah.
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 But in India, it somehow has a very masculine tinge. In Hindi cinema, you're always talking about male dostana and male dosti, and so which is why I
Yeah,
think in
that's
many ways
true.
we went with Yari, which
We
seemed
decided on
to
Yari.
allow more possibilities. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm going to move to something completely different with Pia, of course, which was, as I said, our first climate crisis book. Um, but again, I hope at least this is emerging from this panel. They're quite different from what other climate crisis books look like. And one of the reasons being how Pia, as the editor of the volume, played with the genres of the contributions that became part of the book. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that, Pia?
Yes, absolutely. When when we began thinking about the book, it was squat bang in the middle of COVID-19, and I was working with this research organization, and in India, the lockdown had just been announced, and COVID-19 had been announced as a notified disaster. So, then you can, and you govern accordingly. You govern COVID-19 accordingly. So, and then the migrant, which was shortly followed by the migrant crisis. So, the imagination of the book came through when we saw these various crises sort of, come together, where the migrant crisis and the public health crisis, became sort of indistinguishable from each other, and migrants became pathologized and in their return to their home states. And at the same time, Amphan happened, right? The cyclone Amphan hit, the east of India, to absolutely disastrous and sort of tragic consequences. And I was based in Kolkata at the time. So we began thinking, thinking around the book began at that point. How do we, now we see, and the COVID brought home like nothing else, how interconnected, absolutely interconnected everything is, different kinds of crises. So then it began as a small project where we went, and that's how this sort of multi-dimensionality of the book, or, how we're switching genres, that began with how we imagined the first project that led to the book. We went down to the Sundarbans. I went as a researcher, and my friend went as an investigator, and my colleague rather went as an investigative journalist, and a third colleague went as a podcaster. So we wanted to understand the relationship between climate displacement and how the state responds to it, right, through various dimensions. And so when we were commissioned by our organization, to do this, and when we went there and we spoke to various people, from affected villagers to NGOs dispersing aid, to state officials to track how they responded to the crisis, and we began to see that it was so multidimensional in nature, the question that we were approaching. So we felt that, and the heart of the book that we just published is basically how the climate crisis is not the same for everyone. We are not, we think about it, we tend to think about the climate crisis in abstract terms, millions at risk, etc., right? But is it the same for everyone? No, absolutely not. It completely, geographical vulnerability is everything. So we began from that, and then we wanted to think through, as the book grew, how different institutions and histories and social systems coalesce to produce how the climate crisis manifests in our geography in South Asia. So then we invited different people from different disciplines to we did not want it to be an academic book. The book became a collection of work from academics, activists, lawyers, journalists, and a photojournalist. So it was all, we all gathered in our respective where we were.
And the podcast text as well.
And of course, the most interesting thing was, and the most wonderful thing really about the book, the last chapter, I think, in the book is the podcast transcripts. We carried it was our decision. It was sort of a conscious editorial decision to carry the podcast transcripts of the conversations we had with very, very different sort of people, from villagers who'd been multiply displaced by various climate crises, various cyclones over time, to aid workers, right? And how to understand how during a crisis aid is disbursed, who gets how much, and along what lines aid is received, along in terms of caste and gender. And then And then we had a photojournalist who came and he made this beautiful sort of, I was still finishing with the podcast. So then so the podcast is populated with various voices and most of the interviews are in Bangla. So then we went through the process of transcribing them. It was a podcast and then we offered a transcription and we decided to carry the English transcriptions of the podcast as they were. And that's the last chapter of the book, The idea also was to think about this as a living archive sort of these podcast transcripts as living archives. And I think I was encouraging my organization to upload these transcripts so that and an imagination of the book was that we would have a QR code attached to the book, and when you scan it you can go and you can listen to the voices of people talking about how they have been affected. So it's this is the first book that I've put together. So it's been very exciting, and the hope is that accessibility, as we were also talking about just a little earlier, that the main thing about it is that the climate crisis should not be something confined to academia or science, and it is very much a crisis of the everyday, and people most affected are and then it's so to just break these terms down in ways visually, orally, and definitely also so to a certain extent academically. So it was a great exploration.
That's what I mean. We just thought that anybody who opens the volume will find it interesting to immerse themselves in some part of it based on something that they find they can kind of identify with, and I think that's why it works so well. I'm keeping an eye on the time as well, and I want to ask a question which I'd like all of you to kind of talk about or respond to or ask each other about maybe or whatever. But it's about collaborations and solidarity and how important these have been in our work, and also show themselves in what we write, because that's a huge thing at Yoda Press, and I think we have managed to survive for 20 years because we have held on to this idea of solidarities and collaborations, and don't let people down on that front, and reach out for help when you need to. Does anyone want to go first? Who's particularly excited by this idea? I can go back to Chaura. Chaura, do you want to talk about it?
Yes, absolutely. Solidarity and collaborations for me, maybe it's not exactly what you meant, Arpita, dear, but it resonates with something that both Paswati and Shilpa talked about, which is politics of love and the idea of and the importance of affects. That's what I heard also in their talks, and that's what comes a lot both in Aziz's notebook and also in the Women Life Freedom book, in the chronicles, because actually what happened in Iran in the Women Life Freedom movement is that yes, it was a revolutionary uprising that didn't that wasn't successful in overthrowing the regime until now. But one of the main point is that the resistance didn't arm. Although the two hearts of the uprising were in Kurdistan and in Baluchistan, that are national and ethnic minority regions that are transborder and with a lot of access to arms and with armed groups. So people have arms, but the protesters went in the street with cocktail Molotovs and not with Kalashnikovs, and there was a discipline in not arming the resistance, although there was a lot of dead in the street. What I'm saying that is because the response was, on the contrary, into a politics of affects and love that was by going back into building empathy and solidarity with the people who were executed executed and killed in the street. And you know, Arpita, having read Aziz's notebook, how indifference within the population in Iran to the repression and to the killings of the opponents in the 1980s was important in building, reshaping the Iranian society as, you know, a society living under terror and under dictatorship. So in building, in crafting, in the social fabric of indifference, there was, you know, this politics of terror, etc. And because I have been through that as a child and reconnected with that through the notebook of my grandfather, this is why I see the importance and the difference today when all the Iranians, you know, they hashtag, they practice solidarity and they say, we love you and we miss you and your death, we care about your death, to the people who have died, and they're in solidarity with the families. So this is a, you know, affective resistance. The politics of love as a form of resistance is something I think that is very important, that resonates with things that have been said here.
Right. Thanks for that. And Shilpa, I was just thinking of you while Chaura was speaking, because you're currently translating your great grandmother's diary. Of course, stories could not be more different, but I also, I mean, thoughts on solidarities and also on what Chaura said.
So yeah, I mean, beginning with what Chaura said in relation to solidarity building and to protests and the ways in which people show up for each other, and the ways in which people indicate that there is solidarity, that they're there, and we're seeing it. We saw it in the Zindagi Azadi protests. We're seeing it now in the various protests taking place globally for ceasefire in Palestine. And it's really interesting that I don't know if you've seen this this viral video of, I think, an Indian woman at Colombia making the Azadi call.
Oh yeah,
Hum kya chahe Azadi, which is a long
Azadi, which is
a feminist,
of course,
right? It's a feminist call that feminists have used in India, and I think perhaps in other Hindi,
Kashmir.
Urdu
I think that began in Kashmir and has then come into our cities. Sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely. So it's very much part of what we do, right? And we saw it in India in the anti-CAA protests where women were at the forefront. And it was, and there was a lot of conversation also around food, right? Food was being brought by different people. People were cooking. There were books being sold. There were performances. So it's very much a protest that was produced collaboratively, a protest that was built on solidarity, but a protest that was collaboratively produced. And to talk about collaboration in publishing, to go back to what you were saying earlier, I mean, I enjoy both writing and working on texts, on books, on exhibitions with people. It transforms them because different people bring different ideas. And to talk about the publication of Yari, for instance, it was so exciting to do it with Yoda, because we were having conversations on fonts, on covers, on, you know, it felt truly like a book that we were producing. And with Loiter, it was much more collaborative writing process, you know, and the three of us still can't leave each other. But the publishing itself was actually not very collaborative. We sent the book, then they sent us a cover we didn't like. Then we desperately tried to produce a cover we liked. You know, so it was very it was not collaborative in that sense.
Are you saying it in your are you saying it on record that you prefer Yoda Press to Penguin? Okay, you don't have to answer that.
In the process, definitely.
Okay. I also want to put this question quickly to Bhashwati and Pia, and because we have just last 5 minutes. Bhashwati, solidarity is for you. Shilpa was talking about food, and I was thinking about how there are those lovely evocative scenes of the community cooking together in Victory Colony 1950. But solidarity is what they've meant for you.
Yeah, I think Chaura made an excellent point that, you know, the politics of loss is also invariably the politics of solidarity, because
Yeah.
when you are dispossessed and you have lost so much, you will band together and form new collaborations, new worlds. So I think Victory Colony is a story of solidarity on every front, whether it's for the refugees itself. There is, of course, no other recourse than to pull together and to collaborate and come together as one unit. But even for the volunteers, they also have to build solidarities, because often
Yeah.
often their ambitions or their worldview is at odds with what their immediate families think. So they
Yeah.
also have to form their own universe and own worlds to resist. So I think even soft forms of resistance call for solidarities, and definitely food is a very, very key
Part of
element
that.
of bringing that. And we are seeing that in Palestine, when the Eid celebrations, if one can call that celebrations. But
Mm. Mm.
observation of Eid and how the community has come together and how volunteers are coming together and helping build those solidarities. So I think loss and solidarity are probably like inseparable twins.
How beautifully put. Pia, I think it's serendipitous that we should end with the person who's written on climate crisis, because that looks to the future. And I suppose solidarities or the end, right?
I couldn't put it better myself. When you said solidarity, what it evoked for me instantly in this context was the history of environmental solidarity that we've had in India, with the Chipko Andolan. And so, that idea of solidarity, in some way, in very strong ways in the book, in parts of the book, like the solidarity that people have and people who live close to the land have with the environment, right? And they don't, when you're talking about like indigenous or tribal land, and then you have gods and goddesses, and we've seen this in the Sundarbans in many ways, that you don't want to anger, but that is in a sense, your solidarity to the forest commons, your solidarity with that we will never exploit our natural resources more than, and we'll never over exploit it. And it's governed by, this whole idea is governed by the sense of solidarity. And really, and it forms the very core, I think, ethos of sort of challenging what can be broadly, what the climate crisis is. And if those kinds of solidarity translate into, forms of governance, right? And especially against the exclusionary forms of governance that, we've discussed in many chapters in the book. And it's exactly that's what the need of the hour is: solidarity. And also just to see that there is no separation between, humans and nature, that this planetary life itself is a form of kinship. So, yeah, with that.
Beautiful thought to end this conversation on. Sabine, I can only thank you for letting me chat with four incredible authors of mine and four incredible women, four incredible human beings, as you can see, and giving me this hour with them. So thank you so much, Ananke, and thank you so much, Sabine, for making this happen. And yeah, back to you.
Thank you so much, Arpita. I wanted to add something here. While you were discussing about, so let me just gather my thoughts. I wanted to celebrate you, your authors, and what, publishers like yourself, feminist, independent publishers like yourself have done. What have you done? You have produced content that the big five cannot, or the big four, would be hesitant about. So you're a trailblazer. And, other feminists and independent publishers like yourself. So, congratulations on that. We are, all of you are amazing. And it's, we cannot thank you enough for that.
Thank you so much, Sabine. Thank you. I'm feeling horribly embarrassed now. The moderator should not be spoken about.
No,
That's
well,
why, I mean,
creator is Arpita Das, then yes, definitely.
thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Thanks for the kind words. Chaura, Pia, Shilpa, Bhashwati, so much love for all of you, and please stay in touch.